In tonight's episode, we bring you three haunting stories from across Asia, each one more chilling than the last. One of them takes us deep into the heart of Japan, where whispers of love, death, and the supernatural collide in a way that will leave you unsettled long after the tale ends. It begins in a quiet Edo village, where a soldier returned home from war, believing his life was finally turning toward peace. Instead, what awaited him was a story of devotion wrapped in shadows, and a bride whose presence seemed both comforting and unnatural. The villagers swore she had been buried months before. But if that was true, who was the woman smiling gently at his side, calling herself his wife? Some marriages begin with vows. This one began with a secret the living were never meant to uncover. Hiroshi had never known silence like this before. After years of marching across battlefields, surrounded by the constant noise of guns, clashing steel, and men crying out their final breaths, the stillness of his homecoming felt almost unnatural. He had survived the chaos of war, and now he found himself walking through a narrow dirt path that wound between rice fields and into a quiet Edo village. The village seemed to breathe differently than the world he had left behind, slower, quieter, as though time itself had chosen to sleep here. To Hiroshi, it felt like a place where he could finally rest. He had lost friends, he had lost youth, but perhaps he could still find a piece of himself in the gentle rhythm of village life. His family had long since moved away, but the old house on the edge of town remained standing, waiting for his return. Its paper walls creaked with every step of wind, and the smell of dust carried memories he didn't want to remember. Still, it was home, and after all he had seen, it was enough. It was during those first days back, when his body still twitched awake at the slightest noise, that he met her, Aiko. She appeared as if she had been placed in his path by fate itself, carrying a bundle of flowers and bowing her head with a grace that seemed almost unreal. Her eyes were calm, her movements slow, and her presence made the air around her feel softer somehow, as though the world bent to make room for her. Hiroshi had been hardened by years of death, yet the moment she smiled, something in him cracked open. The village was small enough that everyone knew everyone else. When word spread that Hiroshi had taken Aiko as his wife, people congratulated him politely, but their smiles carried something else, something unsaid. Doors closed a little quicker when he walked by with her. Conversations lowered to whispers as the couple passed. Hiroshi chose to ignore it. He had lived too long in places where suspicion and fear ruled. Here, he wanted peace, and he would not let gossip steal it from him. At night, when the lanterns burned low and shadows stretched long across the tatami mats, Aiko would sit beside him, brushing her hair with slow, deliberate strokes. Her presence was comforting in a way he had never thought he would experience again. And yet, there was something about her quietness, about the way her skin felt cool even when covered by heavy blankets, that unsettled him. He told himself, it was nothing. After all, he was home now, and this was the life he had dreamed of during the endless nights of war. But in villages like this, silence often hides the loudest secrets. And Hiroshi was about to learn that peace sometimes comes at a price the living were never meant to pay. It began subtly, almost too quietly to notice. A small detail here, a fleeting unease there. Hiroshi had convinced himself that he was done with battles, but the war had left him sharper than most. He noticed things other men might ignore. The first sign came at the dinner table. Hiroshi had spent hours preparing a simple meal of grilled fish and rice, a gesture of gratitude to the woman who now shared his home. Aiko smiled as he set the plates down, her delicate fingers brushing the edge of the lacquered tray. She complimented the aroma, praised his effort, and sat gracefully across from him. Yet when Hiroshi picked up his chopsticks and began to eat, hers remained untouched. She held them gently, almost like a prop, but never once lifted a bite to her lips. He teased her for being shy, suggesting perhaps she was not hungry. She only smiled faintly, the corners of her lips curving in a way that neither confirmed nor denied. The second sign came with the nights. The house, though old, should have been warm with the heavy futons and layers of blankets he had prepared for her. Yet, when Hiroshi reached for Aiko in the dark, her skin felt unnaturally cold, as though she had been walking outside in the winter air. He would wake with a shiver, his arm brushing hers, and wonder how someone could carry such chill within them. She always insisted she was fine, offering the same calm smile, the same steady gaze, as if nothing were out of place. Still, Hiroshi tried to ignore it. A soldier does not question small things. He learns to adapt. But then came the scent. Each morning, just as the sun broke over the horizon, Hiroshi would awaken to a faint smell drifting through the house. At first, he thought it was incense from a neighbor's altar. But as the days passed, he realized it was stronger within his own home, clinging to the walls, seeping into the mats. It was not the sweet fragrance used for prayer. It was the heavier, darker scent burned at funerals, the kind that clung to mourning clothes and lingered long after the ashes were buried. The villagers, too, began to act strangely. Hiroshi noticed how they stiffened when he entered the market with Aiko. Their eyes slid away, their conversations cut short. One evening, as he carried vegetables home, he overheard two old women muttering near the well. "How can he not know?" one whispered, her voice tight with fear. "She's been gone for months." The other hushed her quickly, but not before Hiroshi caught the words. His grip tightened on the basket, yet he kept walking, refusing to let the poison of gossip take root. And yet, the words would not leave him. Gone for months. It echoed in his mind each time Aiko brushed her hair in silence, each time her food went untouched, each time that funeral incense thickened in the morning air. The unease became impossible to ignore when Hiroshi finally asked one of the neighbors directly. He mentioned Aiko casually, pretending to seek advice for his new marriage. The neighbor's face paled, his eyes darted away, and his lips pressed into a thin line. "It is good," the man said finally, voice strained. "It is good to have companionship after war." Then he walked away quickly, almost stumbling in his haste. That night, when Hiroshi returned home, he found Aiko sitting by the window, staring out at the moonlit garden. Her posture was still, almost statuesque, and for a moment she seemed less like a woman and more like a shadow carved into the night. When she turned to him, her smile was there again, calm and soft, as though nothing had ever been wrong. But Hiroshi could no longer silence the question that clawed at the back of his mind. If the villagers were right, if Aiko truly had been gone for months before his return, then who, or what, was sharing his house, his bed, his life? The silence of the village no longer felt like peace. It felt like a warning. And Hiroshi was only beginning to understand that some whispers are not born of jealousy, but of fear. The whispers in the village grew heavier with each passing day, and Hiroshi felt their weight pressing in on him. What had begun as unease was now becoming suffocating. Every time he looked at Aiko, he noticed details he had never questioned before. The way she always slipped out at night when she thought he was sleeping. The way the air in the room grew colder around her. The way her reflection in the paper lantern light sometimes seemed a heartbeat out of sync with her movements, as if the world itself struggled to hold her form together. The second strange event came one evening when Hiroshi returned home earlier than usual. He had gone into town to buy candles, and when he pushed open the sliding door, he found Aiko kneeling in the center of the room. Before her, a small wooden shrine had been set up, one he did not own. Atop it burned a single stick of incense, its smoke rising in curling patterns that seemed far too thick, far too deliberate. Aiko's eyes were closed, her lips moving in a whisper he could not quite catch. When she noticed him, she startled, not in guilt, but as though caught in the middle of something sacred. She smiled quickly, too quickly, and began dismantling the shrine before he could ask. "For blessings," she said softly, "for our future." But her hands trembled as she hid the pieces away. It was not just Aiko's behavior. Hiroshi began to notice the villagers avoiding him entirely. The shopkeeper who once greeted him warmly now placed items on the counter without a word. Children who had once played in the fields near his home now scattered when he approached. And then came the old priest. He appeared one afternoon outside Hiroshi's gate, his robes faded, his eyes sharp. Without greeting, the priest spoke. "Some things," he said, "are not meant to return." His voice was hoarse, strained, as if every word was forced from him. When Hiroshi demanded an explanation, the priest only shook his head and muttered, "You must be careful what you invite into your home." Before Hiroshi could press further, the old man turned and walked away, leaving the air colder than before. The final clue came not from words but from stone. Late one night, driven by the gnawing doubts that refused to release him, Hiroshi wandered into the village cemetery. The lantern in his hand flickered weakly as he traced the carved names. And there, beneath a cracked willow tree, he saw it, Aiko's name, etched deep into a weathered headstone. The date carved below it was months before his return. Hiroshi staggered back, his breath caught in his throat. The grave was real, the whispers had been real, and yet, in his home, in his bed, she waited for him with the same calm smile, as though nothing were amiss. The village had stopped pretending. Their silence was no longer indifference, it was fear. A fear that Hiroshi could no longer dismiss, because now he carried it with him into every room where Aiko's presence lingered. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. Hiroshi could no longer sleep. The nights were filled with half-heard whispers and the faint crackle of incense smoke that seemed to drift from nowhere. Each morning, the scent clung to his clothes, to his skin, as if the house itself were steeped in mourning. He tried to confront Aiko, to ask her about the things he had seen, but her answers were always the same, gentle, calm, evasive. She would smile as though he were only tired, as though war had broken more of his mind than he realized. But Hiroshi knew what he had seen in the cemetery. The name carved into stone was not a trick of the lantern light. Aiko had been buried months before, which meant the woman who warmed his home now could not possibly be the same Aiko the village once knew. One night, unable to bear the weight of silence, he pretended to sleep. His breaths came slow and steady as he lay beneath the futon, waiting. Hours passed, the moon climbing higher, until finally he heard the faint creak of the sliding door. He opened his eyes just a fraction and saw Aiko's silhouette slip from the room, her white kimono glowing faintly in the lantern's glow. Careful not to make a sound, Hiroshi followed. His bare feet touched the tatami, then the cool earth outside. The night was unnaturally still. Not even the insects stirred. Aiko walked ahead, her form gliding more than stepping, as though the ground barely held her weight. She carried no lantern, yet the air around her seemed to shimmer with a faint, unearthly glow. She led him to the village shrine, an old wooden structure that leaned with age, its roof heavy with moss. There, beneath the flickering flame of a single lantern, she stopped. Hiroshi's breath caught as he watched. Aiko's form seemed to waver in the dim light, her outline blurring, her pale skin almost translucent. She knelt before the shrine and placed her hands together, her lips moving in silent prayer. And then it happened. Before his eyes, her body began to fade, piece by piece, as though smoke was rising from her skin. Her face dissolved into the night, her arms melted into mist, until only the folds of her kimono remained, neatly arranged upon the ground as if she had slipped out of them without effort. Hiroshi's heart pounded in his chest, his throat dry with terror. He staggered forward, unable to stop himself, reaching for the fabric. The kimono was cold, so cold it burned his fingers, like touching stone left in winter's grip. He dropped it instantly, his body trembling. The silence around him was suffocating. Only the faint hiss of incense drifted from the shrine, curling upward in dark, heavy trails. And in that moment, Hiroshi understood with a clarity that froze him to the core. The woman he had welcomed into his life, the wife he had cherished, was not among the living. She was something else, something that had returned, not out of love, but out of longing so strong it had crossed the boundary between the living and the dead. And now, Hiroshi realized, there was no way to simply walk away. Hiroshi stumbled back from the shrine, his pulse thundering in his ears. The kimono lay folded neatly at the base of the wooden steps, its pale fabric glowing faintly in the moonlight. For a long moment, he could not move. His mind reeled, clawing for explanations, but every path circled back to the same unbearable truth. Aiko was gone, had been gone for months. What he had taken into his home was not the woman he loved, but her shadow. The next morning, desperate for answers, Hiroshi sought out the village priest. The old man received him with weary eyes, as though he had been expecting this visit. He led Hiroshi inside the small temple, the air heavy with the smell of sandalwood and ash. Without speaking, the priest lit a stick of incense and placed it before a weathered altar. The smoke rose in thick spirals, the same dark fragrance that haunted Hiroshi's mornings. At last, the priest spoke. "You have welcomed back one who should not walk among us." His voice carried no malice, only resignation. Aiko's death was sudden. She clung to life, to love, with a grip so strong it tore open the veil. Such spirits do not rest. They linger, feeding on devotion, binding themselves to those who cannot let go. Hiroshi felt his chest tighten. "But I did not call her. I did not summon her." The priest shook his head slowly. "The heart calls louder than words. She returned to you because your longing matched hers. You wished for her without knowing, and she answered. But what comes back is never the same as what was lost." Hiroshi thought of her cold skin beneath the blankets, of the untouched meals, of the faint glow that followed her through the night. All of it made sense now, yet the explanation only deepened his dread. If she was not alive, what was she, and why did she remain? The priest's gaze was grave. "Her presence is not a blessing, it is a weight. The incense you smell each morning, those are her attempts to hide what she is. The dead mask themselves with the rituals of the living, but the mask will not hold forever." Hiroshi's hands trembled. The memory of Aiko's smile, soft and reassuring, twisted into something terrifying. She had not been protecting him. She had been hiding herself. The priest did not offer a solution. He only pressed a strand of prayer beads into Hiroshi's palm and whispered, "Be careful. Love from beyond is never love as you knew it." The world tilted in that moment. Every tender touch, every shared silence, every whispered promise between him and Aiko was not what it seemed. What he thought was comfort had been illusion. What he thought was happiness had been grief, dressed in human form. And now Hiroshi understood. He had not simply married a woman. He had bound himself to a ghost. That night, Hiroshi returned home with the priest's words echoing like a curse. The house looked the same as always, lantern light spilling softly across the tatami, shadows swaying with the wind. And there she was, Aiko, sitting by the window, combing her long black hair with slow, deliberate strokes. She turned when he entered, her eyes warm, her smile gentle, as though nothing in the world was amiss. For a moment, Hiroshi almost believed the lie again, almost let himself sink into the comfort of her presence. But then he noticed the faint trail of incense smoke curling from her sleeve, as if her body itself was burning from within. He dropped the prayer beads the priest had given him, and they struck the floor with a sharp crack. Aiko's smile faltered. Her gaze shifted, no longer tender but sharp, searching, as though she could see the betrayal in his heart. "Hiroshi," she whispered, her voice so soft it nearly broke him. Do not leave me." The words clung to the walls like frost. He wanted to run, to flee into the night, but his legs refused to move. He could only stare as her figure flickered, her outline breaking into smoke and reforming again, fighting to hold its shape. Outside, the wind howled through the village, rattling doors and shutters, as though the world itself was warning him. And yet, in that suffocating silence, one question burned louder than fear. If love had called her back from the grave, what would it take to send her away again? The story of Hiroshi and Aiko is not unique. Across Asia, whispers of love entangled with death appear again and again, as if the boundary between the living and the dead is thinner than we care to admit. Where Japan speaks of wives who return from the grave, China carries its own haunting tale, one of a man who believed devotion could outshine fate. In another quiet village, beneath storm clouds and mountain soil, Liang thought he had found happiness in the arms of a woman named Mei. But just as Hiroshi learned too late, some embraces come with a price. Love may bind souls together, but when that bond defies death itself, the result is never what it seems. This is the second story of the night. Liang had always lived a quiet life, the kind of life that passed unnoticed by the wider world. His village rested in the shadow of a mountain, a place where storms often rolled in without warning and where the fields shimmered with mist long after the rain was gone. He worked the land with steady hands, tending rice paddies as his father had before him. For years, he believed his fate was simple: to grow old alone in the same wooden house where he had been born. That changed on the night of the storm. Thunder tore across the sky, and rain lashed the rooftops like whips. When the storm passed, Liang ventured outside, and there she was. Mei. She stood at the edge of the village road, her hair damp with rain, her silk dress clinging to her frame, as if she had been caught in the flood. She looked fragile, almost too perfect for the mud-soaked earth beneath her feet, yet her smile disarmed him completely. She spoke little at first, her voice soft and melodic, but her presence carried a strange warmth that wrapped around Liang like a blanket after the cold. Within days, she became a fixture in his life. She helped him tend the household, cooked simple meals, and laughed at his awkward jokes. Her elegance seemed out of place in the village, yet the villagers whispered that fate sometimes delivers blessings where they are least expected. For Liang, who had never known the touch of companionship, it felt as though heaven itself had taken pity on him. And yet, there were moments that unsettled him. The dogs barked fiercely whenever she passed, their teeth bared, their hackles raised. Cats darted into alleys, arching their backs, hissing into the air as though they sensed something unseen. Liang dismissed it as superstition. Animals, he told himself, often barked at strangers. But the way they reacted to her, always her, and never anyone else, planted small seeds of doubt. Still, her devotion drowned those doubts quickly. Mei was gentle, attentive, and her laughter filled his home with a music he had never known. Liang found himself falling deeply, helplessly in love, and in time she became his wife. For the first time in his life, he no longer feared growing old. He believed he had finally been granted a chance at happiness. But happiness in the shadow of the mountain was never without its cost. Villagers began to murmur when they thought he wasn't listening. They swore they had seen Mei wandering the graveyard at night, barefoot, her face pale as moonlight. Others said they heard her voice carried on the wind long after midnight, whispering like prayer. Liang tried to ignore them, telling himself that jealous tongues always wag when fortune shines too brightly on one man. And yet, in the deepest corners of his mind, a question began to stir. Who was Mei, really? And what storm had she carried with her when she stepped into his life? It began with small disturbances, details that seemed harmless when viewed alone, but when gathered together formed a shadow that Liang could no longer ignore. One evening, Liang prepared a modest dinner of rice and steamed vegetables. He set the bowls down carefully, expecting May's usual quiet gratitude. She smiled, as she always did, but when he glanced across the table, he noticed her chopsticks never moved. Instead, she sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching him eat with a patience that felt almost unnatural. When he asked if she wasn't hungry, she only tilted her head and said softly, "I am content just to be here with you." It was a beautiful answer, but one that made his skin prickle. Days passed, and Liang realized he had never once seen her finish a meal. The animals grew worse too. The barking of dogs turned to howls whenever May passed. At night, the sound echoed across the empty roads, following her steps like an accusation. Chickens refused to leave their coops when she drew water from the well, and once, when a neighbor's ox stumbled near her, the great beast dropped to its knees in the mud, its eyes wide and rolling with panic. Liang laughed nervously when it happened, trying to explain it away, but inside he felt the chill of dread settle deeper. Then came the night he returned home earlier than expected. Work in the fields had ended sooner, and the village path was empty beneath the fading sun. When he slid open the wooden door, he expected to see May preparing the evening fire. Instead, he found her kneeling before a single red candle, her face bathed in its glow. At first he thought she was praying, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, but when she turned her head slightly, his breath caught. In the dim light, her reflection stared back at him from the bronze mirror placed before the candle. Only it was not the May he knew. The figure in the glass had sunken eyes, black hollows that seemed to pull the light from the room. Her lips sagged open, revealing teeth yellowed and broken. Her skin hung loosely, grey and mottled like rotting flesh. Liang froze, unable to look away. And in that instant, the reflection's mouth curved into a grin, a grotesque parody of the gentle smile he had fallen in love with. May noticed him then. The moment shattered. She turned to face him fully, her features as flawless as they had always been, her eyes soft, her expression tender. The rotting face in the mirror was gone, leaving only the candle flickering harmlessly in the dark. "You're home early," she whispered, her voice light and warm. Liang forced a smile, his heart pounding, his palms slick with sweat. He wanted to ask her what he had seen, but the words refused to come. May rose gracefully and snuffed out the candle with her fingers. The sudden darkness pressed around them, and for a moment Liang swore he could still see that ruined face lingering in the shadows. That night, when she lay beside him, her breath slow and steady, Liang stared into the darkness, wide-eyed and sleepless. The image of her twisted reflection seared itself into his mind. Was it a trick of the light, a product of his exhaustion, or was it something else, something far more terrible? The villagers' whispers returned to him. Barefoot in the graveyard, pale as the moon. Words he had brushed aside now gnawed at him relentlessly. For the first time, he began to wonder if the storm that had brought May into his life had carried something unnatural with it, something that should never have crossed into the world of the living. The days that followed the candle incident grew heavier, as if the air itself thickened around Liang's home. He could not banish the image of May's reflection, yet whenever he looked at her directly, she remained as perfect and serene as ever. The contradiction gnawed at him, keeping him awake through long nights where every creak of the house felt like a whisper from the grave. The second strange event came with the graveyard. One evening, Liang stayed late in the fields, finishing his work beneath the pale wash of moonlight. As he made his way back, he cut across the path near the old cemetery. There, in the corner of his vision, he saw her. May, barefoot, her white robe trailing in the dirt, her long black hair falling over her face. She stood among the gravestones, her head tilted as though listening to something beneath the earth. For a heartbeat, Liang froze. His mind screamed to call her name, to demand why she was there, but his body would not obey. When he finally blinked, she was gone, no trace but the disturbed soil where footprints had sunk into the mud. The next day, he tried to confront her gently. He mentioned the cemetery, hoping to catch some flicker of truth in her reaction. May only smiled, her expression calm, almost pitying, as if humoring a child. "Dreams follow you when you work too hard," she said softly, and brushed his cheek with fingers that felt far colder than they should. Confusion gave way to conflict when Liang sought advice from the village healer, an old woman who had lived long enough to know every superstition carved into the mountain's shadow. When he described May's strange habits, the untouched food, the cold skin, the animal's fear, the healer's eyes narrowed. She clutched the beads around her wrist and leaned close. "You must be careful," she hissed. "Such signs belong not to the living but to the returned. If she came after the storm, it was not the storm that delivered her, it was the soil." Liang recoiled, anger flaring against the old woman's words. "She is my wife," he snapped, though the conviction in his voice wavered. "She is alive. She is with me." The healer shook her head. "Alive things cast shadows that match their form. Watch carefully, and you will see." That night, her warning echoed in his mind as he lit a lantern in their room. May sat by the window, combing her hair, her shadow stretching long across the floor. Liang's breath caught as he noticed the difference, the way her arm moved slowly through her hair, but the shadow's arm lagged behind, a fraction delayed, as if struggling to mimic her. His blood ran cold. Still, May turned to him with the same soft smile, as though she sensed nothing, as though the world had not tilted into nightmare. And in that moment, Liang understood that the healer had not been speaking in riddles. He was living with someone who belonged to the grave, and every day she stayed, the veil between them thinned further. Liang could no longer pretend that everything was normal. The healer's words, the graveyard sighting, the shadow that moved just out of rhythm, all of it clawed at him until he could barely breathe in his own home. He wanted answers, but fear held his tongue, and May's quiet devotion made every question feel like a betrayal. Yet the truth demanded itself, and it came on a night when the storm returned. Rain hammered the roof, lightning split the sky, and wind rattled the shutters with violent fists. May lit a single candle in their room, its red glow spilling across her face. Liang watched her carefully, his heart pounding. The flame flickered wildly, casting shadows that seemed too thick, too dark. And there, in the trembling light, he saw it again, the mask slip. Her reflection in the bronze mirror twisted, revealing sunken eyes like empty wells, skin mottled with decay, lips cracked and blackened, the jaw hung slack, as though held together by threads of will alone. Liang's breath hitched, a strangled gasp escaping his throat. He stumbled backward, knocking the table so hard the candle nearly went out. May turned sharply, her expression caught between sorrow and anger. She rose to her feet, her shadow dragging behind her like a reluctant puppet. "You weren't supposed to see," she whispered. Her voice quivered, fragile, but beneath it lingered something else, something hollow. Liang's knees weakened. What are you?" The words tore from him, harsh and broken. Her gaze softened, and for a moment, she was May again, the May he loved, the May who had filled his lonely house with laughter. Tears welled in her eyes as she sank to the floor. "I was yours once," she confessed. "Years ago, before the flood, my family buried me beneath the mountain soil, but the earth could not hold me. Not when you were still here, waiting. Your heart called me back." Her words struck him like a blade. Memories of the storm, of her sudden arrival, twisted into something grotesque. She had not come to him by chance. She had risen because his longing had tethered her spirit. "But this isn't life," Liang said, his voice shaking, half to himself. This isn't right." May reached for him, her hand trembling, her touch still unbearably cold. "I only wanted to live again, to be with you. Isn't that enough?" Lightning flashed, illuminating her face, half radiant, half ruined, caught between beauty and rot. The sight wrenched a cry from Liang's throat. He staggered back, colliding with the wall, torn between love and terror. The storm outside howled louder, as though the mountain itself groaned in protest. The candle's flame burned high and unsteady, casting shadows that writhed across the walls. May's form flickered, her outline dissolving and reforming as if her body no longer knew whether it belonged to the living or the dead. Liang's world had shattered. His wife was not a blessing, but a revenant, a soul chained to him by grief and longing. And in that moment, he realized with a dread deeper than any battlefield, this was no marriage. This was a haunting. The storm raged through the night, but inside Liang's home, the silence between him and May was louder than the thunder. Her confession still rang in his ears, each word digging deeper into his heart. She had been dead for years. The woman who cooked in his kitchen, who laughed at his side, who lay beside him at night, was nothing more than the echo of love refusing to release its grip. By dawn, Liang could no longer bear the weight of his own ignorance. He sought out the village priest, an old man whose back was bent with time, but whose eyes carried the sharpness of someone who had stared into shadows and lived to tell of them. When Liang poured out the truth, stammering through May's confession, the priest listened without interruption. At last, the old man lit a stick of incense and placed it on the altar between them. The smoke curled in heavy spirals, thick and dark, just like the scent that clung to Liang's home every morning. "Do you understand now?" the priest asked. "The incense is not for blessing, it is to mask her decay, to keep her presence bearable in your world. Without it, her body would betray what she truly is." Liang's breath caught. Every unexplained detail, the untouched food, the icy touch, the animal's terror, now fit together in a pattern too clear to deny. May was not hiding her habits out of shyness or modesty. She was hiding her very nature, struggling to maintain the illusion of life. The priest leaned forward, his voice heavy with warning. "The dead do not return without cost. A revenant clings to the living, feeding on their devotion, their grief, their longing." She was pulled back, not by accident, but by you. Your heart's ache gave her form, your love gave her strength. Liang's hands trembled. "Then I am to blame?" "Not blame," the priest said, shaking his head, "but responsibility. Love is powerful, too powerful. It can call back what should never walk under the sun again. She is not your wife, not as she once was. She is grief made flesh, and grief does not let go willingly." The words struck Liang like ice. He thought of the storm the night she arrived, of how complete she had seemed, how eager he had been to believe that fate had blessed him. Now he understood. It had not been fate at all. It had been longing, binding him to a spirit that could never truly live again. The priest's gaze hardened. "If you wish to release her, it must be done properly. But know this, when the bond is broken, she will not go quietly. Spirits torn from what they cling to often rage like storms before they fade." Liang left the temple with the acrid scent of incense burning in his throat, his heart torn in two. For all the comfort May had given him, she was nothing but death disguised in familiar skin. And now he faced an impossible truth. The woman he loved was never meant to return, yet she was here because he could not let her go. That evening, Liang returned home with the priest's warning echoing like thunder in his skull. The door slid open to reveal May waiting by the hearth, her hair cascading over her shoulders, her face lit gently by the glow of a single candle. She smiled at him, soft and familiar, the same smile that had first unraveled his loneliness. For a heartbeat, he wanted to believe it was all a lie, that she was still the woman he loved. But then he saw it, the faint black ash smudged across her fingers, the incense stick smoldering in the corner, its smoke rising thick and desperate, masking the scent beneath. May rose slowly, stepping toward him, her shadow dragging behind like a reluctant spirit. "You spoke to him," she whispered. Her voice was tender, but her eyes glistened with something darker. "You would send me away?" Liang's throat closed. The prayer beads the priest had given him weighed heavy in his pocket, but his hand refused to move. May's presence filled the room, her body flickering faintly as though her form wavered between flesh and smoke. Outside, the storm winds gathered once more, rattling the shutters, shaking the house. May's smile trembled, breaking into sorrow. "I came back for you, Liang, for love. If you cast me away, where do I go?" The candle sputtered. The incense burned low, her face flickered, half beautiful, half ruined, and her words clung to him like chains. And in that suffocating silence, one question remained. If death itself answered his love once, what would stop it from answering again? Two stories have already shown us how love can cross boundaries it was never meant to. First, with a wife who returned from death in Japan, then with a bride in China whose beauty masked the grave beneath her skin. But Asia holds many kinds of horror, and not all spirits wear the same face. In the islands of the Philippines, whispers speak of creatures that take the form of women, not to comfort the lonely, but to deceive and consume. Where Hiroshi and Liang faced wives tethered by longing, Diego would soon discover that his marriage was something far darker. His perfect home, his loving wife, even the child in the crib, all of it concealed a nightmare born from legend. This is the third story of the night. Diego had always lived by the sea. His small coastal town in the Philippines was the kind of place where the waves beat endlessly against the shore, where fishermen rose before dawn, and where every evening the air carried the scent of salt and smoke. Life was simple, predictable, and quiet until she appeared. Her name was Maria. She was soft-spoken, her voice like the hush of the tide, and her wide eyes seemed to hold secrets too deep to question. Diego met her in the market after a storm, when most villagers were still repairing their homes and mending their nets. She stood alone by the baskets of fish, her hands folded, her presence almost too delicate for such a rugged place. From the moment she smiled at him, Diego felt something he had never known before, an ache for companionship, for family, for something more than the endless rhythm of sea and net. The villagers whispered their warnings. They spoke of spirits in disguise, demons that took the form of beautiful women to lure men into ruin. The old men muttered about tik-tik and swang, about creatures that roamed at night in search of blood and flesh. But Diego was young, strong, and stubborn. He had no patience for superstition. To him, Maria was no spirit. She was a blessing. Their courtship was short. Within months, Maria became his wife, and the villagers' gossip fell silent, replaced by uneasy glances whenever she walked by. Diego ignored them all. Life seemed perfect now. Maria kept the house warm and clean. She filled their table with food, humming softly as she worked. And when their daughter was born, Diego believed his happiness was complete. But shadows lingered even in their brightest days. Maria never set foot inside the small church on the hill, always waiting outside whenever Diego attended services. She grew uneasy when prayers were spoken aloud, her hands twitching, her gaze sliding toward the ground. At night, she often woke before dawn and stood by the window, staring out into the dark with eyes that glistened strangely in the moonlight. Diego noticed, of course. A husband always notices. But love has a way of drowning doubt, and Diego drowned willingly. He told himself she was different, but not dangerous, that her silence was shyness, not secrecy, that the villagers' stares were envy, not warning. Still, when he looked into his daughter's face and saw the faint gleam of sharp, unnatural teeth, he felt a flicker of fear, just enough to keep him awake at night. Just enough to wonder if the sea had delivered him a wife, or something else entirely. At first, Diego convinced himself that his unease was nothing more than the paranoia planted by village gossip. He loved Maria. She was kind, attentive, and her presence filled his house with a warmth he had never known before. But slowly, little things began to pull at the edges of his certainty, like threads unraveling a carefully woven net. The first sign came during a festival. The church bells rang through the town, and Diego joined the crowd in carrying candles up the hill toward the small chapel. He expected Maria to follow at his side, but when they reached the stone steps, she froze. Her face drained of color, her wide eyes fixed on the glowing cross above the door. She smiled faintly, masking her hesitation, and told him she would wait outside. Diego pressed her gently, urging her to join him, but she shook her head, her hands tightening around their daughter as if the building itself might burn her. It unsettled him, though he told himself perhaps her faith was simply different. Yet the second sign came not long after. On nights when the wind howled through the trees and the waves crashed violently against the rocks, Diego would sometimes wake to find Maria standing at the window, her back rigid, her hair falling in dark waves down her shoulders. She stared into the night, unblinking, her lips moving in silent rhythm. When he asked what she was doing, she would smile softly and say, "Listening." But to what? She never explained. The unease deepened with the animals. Dogs snarled whenever she walked near, their bodies stiff, their teeth bared. Chickens refused to feed if she approached the coop, scattering in frantic bursts of wings. Even the village goats tugged against their ropes, bleating in panic when she passed. Neighbors whispered more openly now, muttering that no good ever came to those who ignored warnings. Diego bristled at their words, defending his wife with anger he did not fully feel. But the moment he could not shake came one night when their daughter cried in her sleep. Diego rose groggily to soothe her, only to find Maria already bent over the crib. At first, the sight comforted him until he noticed how still she was. She wasn't rocking the child or whispering lullabies. She was crouched low, her face hovering above their daughter's, her shoulders rising and falling with heavy breaths. Diego called her name softly, and she startled, straightening too quickly. Her eyes flashed in the dim light, gleaming like wet stone. She smiled, of course, brushing it off, saying the baby had simply startled her. But Diego couldn't shake the image, the way Maria had crouched, almost animal-like, her face too close, her body too still. That night, Diego lay awake beside her, listening to the rhythm of her breathing. It was steady, calm, almost too calm, as if she were pretending to sleep. His mind replayed the warnings he had dismissed, the villagers' whispers, the healer's muttered prayers, the stories of tik-tik and a swang that had haunted the coastline for generations. For the first time since he had met Maria, Diego felt a sliver of doubt carve into his heart. He had chosen to ignore the signs, but the signs were no longer subtle. They were knocking on his door, seeping into his home, pressing against his very bed. And he could no longer deny it. Something about his wife was not what it seemed. The unease in Diego's home began to spread like a sickness, and no matter how tightly he clung to denial, the cracks widened with each passing day. The villagers had grown bolder in their whispers, and though none dared speak to him directly, their avoidance spoke louder than words. Mothers pulled their children away when Maria passed. The old fishermen crossed themselves when she drew water from the well. Diego told himself they were blinded by superstition, but deep down, he feared they saw something he refused to acknowledge. The second strange event came one afternoon when Diego returned from the shore earlier than expected. As he stepped into the house, he heard a sound, a wet, slithering noise, that made the hairs on his neck rise. He moved quietly toward the bedroom, and there he saw Maria crouched over their daughter's crib again. But this time her mouth was open impossibly wide, her jaw stretched far beyond what was human. A long, forked tongue hovered above the child, swaying like a serpent poised to strike. Diego gasped. Maria snapped her head toward him, her mouth snapping shut with a crack. For a heartbeat, her eyes glowed faintly red, but then she blinked, and they were only her wide, soft eyes again. She was crying, she said gently, smoothing her hair back into place. I was comforting her. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, as though she were daring him to challenge her. Diego backed away, heart pounding, and forced a nod, but the image of that gaping mouth seared itself into his memory. The conflict came soon after. One of Diego's closest friends, a fisherman named Ramon, pulled him aside after Mass. Ramon's face was pale, his eyes darting nervously. You need to leave her, he whispered harshly. You don't see it, but we do. She's not what she pretends to be. That child, your child, already bears her mark. Diego bristled, anger flaring even as fear gnawed at him. She's my wife, he snapped. Speak of her that way again, and we are no longer friends. Ramon only shook his head, pity in his gaze. Then you'll learn the hard way, but when you do, it may already be too late. That night, the warning replayed in Diego's mind as he lay beside Maria. He turned his head just slightly, and in the glow of the dying lamp, he saw her staring at the ceiling with her eyes wide open, unblinking. Her lips moved silently, as though whispering prayers or curses that only she could hear. The final clue came days later, delivered not by man but by beast. A crow landed on the roof of their home and refused to leave, cawing endlessly until Diego threw a stone to drive it off. When it finally took flight, Diego noticed something glinting on the ground where it had perched. He bent to pick it up and froze. It was a baby's tooth, sharp, pointed, and blood-stained. Diego stared at it in horror. He thought of his daughter's small mouth, the way her teeth had always seemed too sharp, too strange. His stomach turned as dread settled in. The villagers' warnings were no longer just superstition, they were truth. And Diego was beginning to realize he had brought something into his home that was never meant to be called a wife. The night of truth came without warning. Diego had grown used to sleeping lightly, his ears trained to catch every sound. But this time, the cry of his daughter jolted him awake like a blade to the chest. It was not the soft whimper of a child, but a scream, sharp and terrified, cutting through the house. He stumbled to his feet, his heart racing, and rushed toward the crib. The moment he pushed open the door, the world seemed to stop. Maria was crouched low, her back arched unnaturally, her hair hanging in thick strands over her face. The candlelight revealed what Diego had tried so hard not to see. Her mouth was split, impossibly wide, stretching far beyond human form. Rows of jagged, gleaming fangs filled her jaws, each one glistening with saliva. From between them slithered her tongue, long, forked, slick with hunger. It hovered over their daughter, twitching, swaying closer and closer to the baby's face. Diego froze, horror pinning him in place. His mind screamed at him to act, but his body refused. The room was filled with sounds he could barely comprehend, the baby's frantic cries, Maria's heavy breathing, and the sickening hiss of her tongue tasting the air. Then Maria turned. Slowly, her head lifted, and her face emerged from the curtain of hair. Her eyes glowed with an inhuman light, her mouth still gaping, her tongue curling outward. For the first time, she did not bother to hide what she was. Diego stumbled backward, his hands shaking violently. "Maria, what are you?" His voice cracked, raw with terror. She rose from the crib with a fluid, unnatural grace. The skin along her arms shimmered, peeling in strips that revealed something shriveled and childlike beneath. Skin too tight, too gray, like that of a corpse. "I am what you wanted," she hissed, her voice layered with tones, some high and childlike, others deep and guttural. "A wife, a mother, a family. Did I not give you everything?" Diego's chest tightened, his throat dry as sand. You're not human. Maria's face twisted into a grin, exposing her fangs fully. And yet you loved me. You called me into your life. You welcomed me into your bed. You gave me a child. Do you think such bonds are made without cost? The baby wailed louder, her small fists trembling in the air, and Maria snapped her head back toward the crib. Her tongue lashed out, the forked tip curling dangerously close. That broke Diego's paralysis. He lunged forward, grabbing the wooden crucifix that hung on the wall. With a trembling hand, he thrust it out between them. The air split with a shriek so piercing it rattled the windows. Maria recoiled violently, smoke hissing from her skin where the cross came near. Her beauty shattered completely now. Her face sagged, her flesh cracking, her body shriveling into the twisted form of a demon child, crouched and snarling, her eyes burning with hatred. Diego's mind spun, his soul caught between heartbreak and terror. The woman he had loved, the mother of his child, had never been either. She was a mask, a monster in disguise. And she was no longer pretending. The crucifix trembled in Diego's hands, its weight suddenly feeling heavier than iron. Maria hissed, her voice no longer melodic but fractured, layered with tones that clawed at his ears. Smoke curled from her skin as she staggered back, her body flickering between the illusion of the woman he had loved and the shriveled, monstrous thing beneath. At last, she let out a shriek that made the air vibrate, then collapsed to her knees. Her chest heaved, her fangs glinting in the candlelight. "You do not understand," she rasped, her forked tongue twitching like a dying snake. "I was never only Maria. I was chosen by hunger, by the curse that walks these islands. The tik-tik hides in the shape of desire. You men long for wives, for children, and so we answer. We come because you call us." The words struck Diego like thunder. Every whisper he had ignored, every warning the villagers had spoken, it was all true. The storm had not delivered him a blessing, but a curse wearing the skin of a bride. He remembered the way animals snarled, the way she recoiled at prayer, the way her hands trembled at the chapel steps. These were not quirks, they were truths hiding in plain sight. Still, a part of him could not let go. "And the child," he demanded, his voice breaking. "Is she mine or yours?" Maria's lips twisted into a smile that was equal parts sorrow and cruelty. "She is both," she whispered. "Born of your blood, yet marked by me. You cannot know which side will win. Perhaps she is human, perhaps not. But you will see me in her, one way or another. My hunger lives in her teeth." Diego's chest tightened until he thought his ribs might break. His gaze fell on the crib, where his daughter whimpered softly, her sharp little teeth glinting in the dim light. He wanted to believe she was innocent, untouched by the darkness that had deceived him. But Maria's words wrapped around his heart like chains. The demon child's body began to crumble, her skin peeling into ash that drifted across the floor. Her laughter rang out one final time, high and childlike, echoing as if from deep inside the earth. The sound carried both love and mockery, as though she delighted in the ruin she left behind. Then she was gone. Nothing remained but the lingering smoke, the faint scent of rot, and the weight of her final revelation. Diego stood frozen, the crucifix still clutched tight in his trembling hand. His wife had never been human. His marriage had been a deception. And, worst of all, the future of his daughter, his only child, was now a question he might never be able to answer. The house was silent after Maria's laughter faded, but Diego felt no peace. The crucifix slipped from his hand and clattered against the floor, the sound echoing like a bell in the emptiness. He stumbled toward the crib, his heart hammering, and looked down at his daughter. Her small face was calm now, her eyes shut as if nothing had happened. She breathed softly, like any other child, but when she stirred, her lips parted, and Diego caught sight of the faint gleam of teeth, too sharp, too pointed, unnatural in the mouth of an infant. He froze, unable to breathe. The villagers' warnings returned to him, their muttered prayers, their fearful glances. Had they known? Had they seen in his child what he had refused to see in his wife? He scooped the baby into his arms, clutching her to his chest. She was warm, alive, fragile. She was his daughter. And yet, as her tiny jaw twitched in her sleep, Diego felt a chill crawl up his spine. Maria's words echoed mercilessly in his mind. My hunger lives in her teeth. Outside, the waves crashed against the rocks, carrying the sound of laughter with them, faint, distant, yet unmistakably hers. Diego sank to the floor, the child trembling in his arms, his future uncertain. He had survived the demon that had worn his wife's face, but as he stared down at his daughter's too sharp smile, one question seared itself into his soul. Was he raising a child, or her curse reborn? I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you liked them and want to listen to more, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.